Hey gang, today we're going to be using this apple to explore multi-part plaster molds. So come join in the fun and play along at home.
You're going to need plaster and water-based clay for this process, and here are the tools that I used.
So I'd like to talk about how to break up our mold. Here we have a cross section of our apple, and we're going to figure out how the mold should come apart in order to not have any undercuts. So the first thing I would consider is breaking it apart in two pieces. And this is problematic for a couple reasons that you can probably see right off the bat, right? As we try to pull our mold apart, we now have this undercut, which is either going to break off our mold or it's going to break our casting. So that's not going to be very helpful. So let's look at another solution. So if we split our mold in half, 50-50, but we move our seam line in the other direction, this is actually a much better solution, but maybe not a perfect solution. So we see here that we don't really have any undercuts. There shouldn't be much of an issue if we are absolutely perfectly 50-50. And if we go just a little bit off center, or if there's a little bit of a bulge that we didn't really notice, we can have the potential for trapping. There's also another issue, which is once I get one half of the mold off, it's actually kind of difficult. I don't have much to grab onto here to pull this apple out. I can't drive a wedge. I can't do anything to help pull this apple out. There's not a lot of grip to grab onto this apple to pull it out. So now if we try to tackle this with a 4-part mold, this kind of solves a bit of our situation, which is we can now pull off individual pieces without much of an issue. And you can see here, it's very easy to grip my apple, right? So as I move these pieces apart, and then to get the apple out of the mold, it's a very easy move to pull these two pieces apart, which is fine. But we've kind of got one last little issue, which is I would rather not have my plaster this dramatically tapered. See, this becomes a very vulnerable point for plaster, and it's going to want to break off. Not only am I going to lose my detail, but it'll become an issue within the casting if that breaks off during the casting process. So there's one way to make this mold just a little bit better. So now what we've done, and we still have a 4-part mold, but what we've done is we've made sure that we are coming off of the apple in a perpendicular manner. And that's very important. So if I were to put a seam line anywhere along here, I want to make sure that I'm making it perpendicular to the surface. No matter what I do, I'm going to have this square angle coming off of my apple. So what that allows us to do is that allows us to have a mold that's as square as possible on all edges, and that gives us the most rigidity with our mold, which is going to give us the longest life with our mold.
Here's an apple mold that I already had made up, and I want you guys to start to see where it is that we're heading, so you can wrap your head around what it is this mold is going to look like in its final iteration. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create all 4 parts of our plaster mold one piece at a time. And so what I'm building here is I'm going to build up a form out of clay that's going to allow me the ability to cast the first piece of the plaster mold. I'm going to begin by embedding the apple into the clay right up to the seam line. But I don't want to have too big of a hollow below the apple because I don't want that apple to shift on me. So I'm going to dig out that clay in a very careful manner so that the apple sits in there nice and snug. I have the luxury of straight seam lines on this first piece, so that means my surface is going to be very, very flat. But if your seam lines are not straight, that's fine. Just make sure your clay follows the seam lines. Don't try to get your seam lines to follow a flat clay surface. This is a very important part of the mold making process. I'm bringing the clay right up to my model and I'm following that seam line as true as I can. But the thing that I'm trying not to do is have the clay wash up onto the surface of my model. I want to make sure that clay is hitting the model as perpendicular as possible so that I can leave a nice crisp edge so I can create a strong mold. Here I'm looking to mark out the angles for the next portion of my form. And everything should be perpendicular to the surface of the apple. You can see here that that perpendicular angle applies to every surface on the apple, not just the places where we drew it out on the clay.
Another thing to consider is how are we going to get material into this hollow space once we finish our mold? Well, that's going to be what we call a sprue. And that's basically just a funnel or an opening that we're going to allow in our design of the mold in order to get liquid into this space in here. The first thing we want to do is figure out the placement of the sprue. Now, if this is the top of my apple and this is the bottom of my apple, keep in mind that sprue is going to leave a bit of a blemish behind. So I would prefer to put that sprue on the bottom somewhere so that it's less cleanup for me to do down the road. So here's the first possibility for our sprue. We want to make a nice funnel shape that's going to allow us to pour liquid into here, and then it's going to fill up our chamber. So the first thing we do is pour liquid into our hollow chamber here, and then as the liquid fills up, we're going to run into a bit of an issue. As we've gone ahead and we've filled up our mold, we've trapped air in here. There's no way for this air to go down and then to come back up. So we've got an air pocket to deal with, and then we've also have one last little detail as well, which is when I start to pull this mold apart, this sprue is going to be stuck inside of this piece of the mold. So when you pull the mold apart, generally you end up with a little blemish on the bottom that now has to be filled in. So this solution is not going to work for us. So I've gone ahead and I've made a couple adjustments to my mold here. We still have the sprue, we still have that funnel, and that's going to allow liquid to pour in here. But I've also allowed for the possibility of a vent, a way for air to escape out of my mold. And then the last thing I've done is I've gone ahead and I've made this piece a little bit smaller. If you noticed, it was over here before, and I've moved it up. And what that does is that gives me this ability to put a vent right at the very peak of this hollow. So any air that's trapped is going to be able to escape. I'm not going to get any resting bubbles in there. And so once I fill this up with liquid, what I'm left with on my casting is I have a sprue and I have a vent, and that is going to be very easy to cut off nice and flush, and I don't have to worry about it making a little pock mark or anything like that.
And here's where I would put the sprue, And keep in mind that this is only a part of the sprue, because I'm going to add a piece onto this part of the mold, and then as we continue through the mold, we're going to add more on. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to take away this portion of the sprue, because I want to show you what happens if you forget to add the sprue on. What we've created here is basically 3 out of the 4 parts of our plaster mold in clay. And so what we're really doing here is creating the negative space for the first piece of our plaster mold. Now it's time to trim our clay to size. And it's very important that you leave at least an inch of clay all the way around your object. We want to make sure we have enough material for our mold. I left an 1.5 inches all the way around the apple, and I even left more down at the bottom to accommodate the sprue. I'm taking the time to square everything off right now, because the more precise I am about that now, the easier it's going to make my mold making process as we get further into this. Here we are laying out the keys, which is a very important part of the mold making process.
I want to look at a cross-section of a simplified version of what we're doing. So we have 2 parts of a mold and then a hollow in the middle where our apple would be, or any object. What we've been doing is we've been taking all this time to make sure these surfaces are nice and flat, right? We're getting those nice perfect surfaces. But what's to keep this mold from shifting around in this direction now? Once we have it anchored, how are we going to align it? Well, that's where the keys come into play. So we're going to create something like this, where when we're building our clay, we're going to leave little hollows. And then as we pour our plaster over our clay, it's going to make a little bump that will align with this recess. And then once we have all the parts of our mold made, we'll have this perfect alignment that'll help our mold come back together every time we open it up. So I want to look at the keys really quickly and how we're going to determine what the shape and location of our keys are going to be. So the first thing that we need to do is figure out where to locate our keys. So we actually want our keys to be about halfway between the edge of our mold and our object. So we want to really find that center point. So we can't find the center point to locate our key until we figure out how wide our mold is going to be. And our mold wants to be at least 1 inch all the way around in every direction. From the edge of the object to the edge of the mold, we want at least 1 inch. And on my mold, I think I have about 1.5 inches. So then once we go ahead and we cut our mold to size, then we can determine our center point, and then we can go ahead and cut in our keys. So the keys are going to have a couple things that we're going to need to consider. The first is going to be the size of the key. And this is very important. We want to make sure our key is wider than it is deep. And what that does is, if we imagine an over-exaggerated key, this type of key on some sort of object is going to be very vulnerable to breaking off. So we want to avoid that. So we want to make sure we're wider than we are deep. The next thing we want to consider is this crisp corner. If we have a key shaped something like this, it's going to be very easy for our mold to pop out of this and slide around. So this nice crisp corner gives us a great alignment and a very quick alignment. It's very easy to put our mold back together. And then lastly, you guys probably noticed that as I drove my tool down into the clay went ahead and pushed up. So I created a little bit of a burr here. And I want to make sure that I knock this burr down in both directions, because every time I knock the burr down, when it goes like that, it'll push back out in this direction. And then I want to kind of take a little bit away there. So it was this back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until you get a nice crisp edge.
as you guys are working on your keys, be very aware to not make any undercuts with your keys. So for instance, my tendency here is to want to cut my key in the direction of my clay, perpendicular to the surface of my clay, and the same here. But what I actually want to do is I want to make sure that my keys are cut straight up and down. All of my keys, all the way around, are moving in the same direction. And what that does is that allows for my mold to pull straight off. If I were to have a key that went at this angle and I had a key at this angle, that angle, then all of a sudden I've created a trap for my first part of my mold, and I'm not going to be able to get this apart without breaking my keys.
And now we'll use the cottle boards to complete our form so we can cast the first piece of our plaster mold. We want to make sure that we have an inch of plaster above the apple. So this is a handy little trick to make sure that you pour enough plaster into your mold. Just put a little piece of clay 1 inch above the highest point of the apple. And here we are squaring off the forms to make sure our mold comes out nice and square. And now we're going to take a little extra clay and we're going to seal off all the places where plaster can start to leak out of our form. And please, please do not forget your mold release. Every semester I have somebody that forgets to put mold release on. I'm using it here on the tops of the cottle boards because that's quite a porous surface, and if I splash any plaster up there, it'll be an easy cleanup. I'm also putting it on the inner surface of the cottle boards. Now I don't necessarily need it there because this is a non-porous surface, but it's going to help me with the demolding process anyway. And there's no need for me to use it on the clay or even my apple. My apple is a non-porous surface. So if you're using anything like glass or plastic or anything non-absorbent without much of a texture, you're not going to need mold release. If you're in doubt, put mold release on it. Don't chance it. Just a little refresher on mixing plaster. We're going to add enough plaster to our water so that we have just a slight skim coat of water sitting on top of our plaster. And if you're wondering about my copious amounts of fluff containers, don't worry, I don't have an addiction. It's actually a recycling program that I have with a friend of mine that works at an ice cream shop. Now you'll notice here I'm not going to use a brush for my splash coat. I'm just going to pour directly in. Now if you pour from a bit of a height and you pour a thin stream, it actually helps to reduce bubbles. And because I don't have a whole lot of texture on my apple, I'm not too concerned about bubbles sitting on the surface of my apple. And now I want to show you my bonehead move. What I ended up doing was I have my vibrating table here, and right as I was about to turn it off, I ended up turning it on full blast and actually broke the seal around the mold, and you can see the plaster started to spill out. So always keep a little extra clay on hand in case your form does spring a leak. Because I lost some plaster out of my mold, I had to add a bit more in. I was too gun shy to try to use the vibrating table again, so I just ended up pounding on the table with my fist in order to release those bubbles and let them all rise to the surface. Which is a great technique for you guys to use at home if you don't happen to have a vibrating table. Although I did record myself making this table, and maybe I'll try to get that video out to you guys fairly soon. So now you can see the plaster that's mixed in with the clay is not supposed to be there. That's a result of my vibrating table mishap. But no real damage was done, and it's easy enough to clean up. It's very important that the apple does not come out of the plaster mold until we are completely done with all parts of the mold. So I'm taking extra care to make sure that the apple doesn't even budge a little bit as I'm removing the clay. Because once an object comes out of the mold, it's near impossible to get it to fit back in exactly the way it was, which will cause misalignments in the mold as we make the other parts. It's at this point that I have the opportunity to clean up any little blemishes on the mold that I'm not happy with. Now we're getting prepared to cast the second piece of our 4-part mold. You can see here I'm creating my form slightly differently than I did on the other side. The reason for that ridge line down the center of both of those pieces is not going to affect the function of the mold at all, but what it does is it gives me a visual cue as to how to align this mold when I have it all laying out on the table in a bunch of pieces. And I'm also adding 2 keys onto each one of these pieces instead of 1 for the same reason. It's just a visual registration. When you have a mold that has pieces that are very similar to each other, it's very easy to waste a lot of time trying to assemble your mold back together. And once again, do not forget your mold release. You will absolutely need it on the plaster. If you have a level, it will ensure that everything in your mold comes out square. And you can see here, I'm still too shy to use my vibrating table, so I just end up pounding the table a little bit. It's a little hard to tell with the fast forwarding effect going on here in the video, but I'm handling my mold very carefully at this point because I want to ensure that I don't cause those 2 pieces of the mold to pop apart on me. Now let's talk about the sprue. So in this scenario, I've forgotten to put the first part of my sprue on, but I've remembered to do the second part. So I'm going to put half of my sprue on right now, and you can see I just outlined where the other half will go later on. And now I'm going to take the time to clean up my mold. There's a little misalignment on the seam line where the two pieces come together, so I'll go ahead and just clean that right up. The interesting thing about plaster is it does shrink ever so slightly. So I've gone ahead and I've overfilled my mold with plaster, and I've waited till it's set up just enough where I can pull down that clay wall without it spilling over. And now I'm going to go ahead and smooth out that surface. So instead of having a piece of my mold with a big divot in it, I'm going to have a nice flat even surface. And here you can see that plaster actually shrink up as the water evaporates off. And I'll play that one more time because it looks so pretty.
There we go. Plaster is set up. All four parts of our mold are now complete. And now we're ready to open it up. So what we're going to do is make some thin wedges. I've made these out of just some popsicle sticks I had laying around. The key to this process is going to be thin wedges though. And here's why. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to wedge this mold apart from all sides. And the way we want to do it is we want to lift up evenly, right? We don't want to hinge this mold open for fear of breaking off some of those keys or breaking off something else. But the thin wedge is going to be key because we don't want to put too much pressure on any one spot. So I have a large collection of hammers, probably 30 to 40 hammers hanging around my house. And I searched through all of my hammers to find the most appropriate hammer for this job. And that happens to be my cutest hammer. Now I'm using this hammer to illustrate a point, and that point is I do not want to put a lot of force behind these wedges. What I want to do is I want lots of wedges all around as many spots as I can have, and I'm going to gently tap them in and move around the mold. And what that's going to do is that's going to help me lift straight up. So in this first piece, I'm just curious. I want to try this. I want to see if I can just simply pull it apart. And it's not. That's pretty well established there. Okay, so it looks like we're going to need the wedge on this one. I put my mold back together because I want to illustrate a couple points. The first is our wedges. Now we want to talk about this mechanical advantage that we're getting from a wedge. It's actually technically a very, very simple machine. And what that machine does is it takes force going in this direction and it makes the force go in this direction, which is exactly what we wanted, right? Because we wanted our mold to pull apart in this direction, right? So that's exactly what we got from our wedges. Now you guys noticed that I didn't put any wedges around here, right? No wedges along there, only along this edge, because that was the direction I wanted to move, up and down. If I had taken a wedge and put it right here, it would have, move that more camera. If I had taken a wedge and put it right here, it would have taken the force and pushed it in this direction, right? Right like that. But I don't want to move in that direction. I would have probably popped plaster off or done something. I want it to move in this direction. I want these two pieces to move away from from each other in that direction. That's the way we made the keys. That's the way we've designed our mold. So the only place that I can put a wedge to separate these two pieces is right here. But that being said, there's one other little hitch to this that I want to show you guys. Okay, I hope you guys can see this. So if we were to look at this, if we were to look at this mold in profile, this is a piece of the mold. I poured this in, and what happened was, because I poured that plaster right up to the top and I didn't accommodate that with any sort of clay, or I didn't build anything up, now what's happened is I have this feather thin edge, which is fine. That's not a problem right now. We can take that away. But if I were to use this feather thin edge to drive my wedge, you can see my wedge is just going to drive into my plaster. What I need to remove this thin fin so that my wedge can drive at this angle and separate these two pieces of the mold over here. But you can imagine we need to separate these two pieces of the mold in this direction.
And you can see here where I probably didn't dig down deep enough on that, and the angle was a little bit off, and I kind of gouged my mold a little bit.
So one thing I'd like to point out is this is one of the reasons why we want to be perpendicular to our surfaces. Breaks off so easily.
And now it's time to take care of the missing part of our sprue. Now, just because it is set in plaster doesn't mean it's set in stone. So we're going to carve that out and accommodate the other half of the sprue that we forgot. Now you remember we talked about air vents, and I don't have any air vents in my mold as of yet, but I want to test my mold first to see if air vents are even necessary, and if they are, I can carve them in the same manner as the sprue.
Phase 1 complete. We have the 4 pieces of our mold set and ready to go. We have a few blemishes here and there, but nothing that is going to obstruct this mold from functioning properly. Thanks for playing along at home, and check out the next video to see what we do with this mold. What's that?
Nail.
Oh, it's for nails? Yeah, it kind of looks like it, right? See, when we do the nails, we go, ooh, we got to do your nails. with our little messy hair. Okay, Daddy's got to record now. Yeah. We're going to leave all that right there.
Meow.
All right, let's get going. Come on over here. Okay, Duck.